You guys saw the thumbnail, y'all know what's coming next. What's up, you guys, and welcome back to the Prime Vanguard channel. In today's video, I'll be showcasing my Gramgrace deck profile for the standard format post my Bushiroad Springfest Rosemont event. Over this past week, I had the opportunity to play in the Illinois Rosemont event for Springfest. Going along with my team, we weren't very successful at all in that tournament that day, but I did have a lot of fun. I had the opportunity to play against the current meta of Vanguard, and I'm looking forward to see what standard has going for it next. Since me playing Gramgrace in that tournament, I have definitely changed the deck a lot. There are a lot of cards now that I feel a lot more confident about having into the deck simply for the fact that the direction of where the meta is going post set 10 or even currently now in the Vanguard format. I think the new support I have is going to be very strong against the current meta, as I've had a lot of experience now playing against it. And the Gramgrace build that I took towards that event that was in my community tab that I've showcased is very different than the list that I have come back to now. The list that you guys saw me play when I was in that event and I was playing in the tournament was one where there were a lot of changes made on the sly, and I was doing a lot of like back and forth between cards because I didn't have that much practice against the current meta. But now that I played in the tournament and I've had a little more experience with the deck outside of it, and I've took the opportunity to learn from my losses in that event, I can honestly say that this is probably the most confident Gramgrace deck that I've had so far that has been doing me really well. I will say though that playing online and just talking to friends about it, as well as discussing with my opponents on how we can improve the deck and just the direction of where Gramgrace is at right now until we get our start deck support with the new promo cards as well as the new ride line for Gramgrace. I'm very excited to say that this is a Gramgrace deck that I probably will be playing for the rest of the format until set 10 comes out or until we get the Gramgrace support. And I felt like showcasing with you guys because I think that it's a really interesting take on the deck, especially considering the fact that the meta that's coming in with the mask support within a couple of weeks at the time making this video is really going to shake up the current meta. With that being said, I'm ready to showcase to you guys my new Gramgrace deck and all of the changes I've made since Bushiroad Springfest Rosemont event.
Alright, you guys, so to get this deck profile started off with, I am playing the Blaster Dark Ride line for Gramgrace. In my previous post for Gramgrace, going into the tournament, I was using the Genesis ride line to improve consistency and get extra cards in the soul. The idea behind that ride line was that I couldn't be damage denied for it because my Vanguard didn't cost me any points of damage, so people would be more inclined to give me extra damage so I can use my other card effects. With the additional counterblast that now exists in this Gramgrace build, it's going to be important that I can use at least 1 to 2 counterblasts every single turn for my Gramgrace and one of my other rear guard effects. That was the idea prior. However, in real life, that ride line only works with certain pieces that do not exist yet. I tried it from a Japanese list that I saw, and while it is consistent and it did accomplish the goal that I wanted it to, I missed the extra aggression that this ride line gave me. Getting extra cards in the early game is super important, especially with the way that Overdress or Standard is going now, because in my early games when I was on that ride line and I was doing the grade 2 gaming with Chronojet, or I was going back and forth with my opponents in the early game, I didn't get the extra card to my hand unlike from before with the Blaster Dark ride line, and it hurts. Gramgrace is a deck that needs to see its pieces so that going into its turn, it can actually make a really solid push against the opponent, and if it does not have that, it really does hurt the deck. It's not fun whatsoever when you can't make any solid formations or attacks because you're lacking on the pieces needed to do so, and I missed the ride line because of that. Since the tournament, I went back to the Blaster ride line and have incorporated some new changes to the deck that really are working extremely well. The additional aggression from this card, as well as being able to take a unit if my opponent wants to rush me going first, is really incredibly helpful. And if not, it does deter the opponent from putting down another rear guard when they're going second because they know it's going to get retired, which reduces the amount of attacks that I take in the early game, meaning that I have more cards to use in the later game, which will be extremely helpful. Moving on to grade 3s, I am playing 3 copies of Sword Saint Knight Dragon Gramgrace. Obviously the star of the show, Gramgrace, despite me not winning, I think is still an incredible card. The additional attack, draw power, as well as the addition of cards by getting a 2-card draw from this card is fantastic. It helps you set up going into your next turn, which really matters when you start doing Persona rides, and making sure that your formation is extremely powerful and all set up to go to push against your opponent is a big deal. Despite all the decks that now have extra shield value or have extra early game push, like this deck now does have, it still is important that come the late game that Gramgrace can continue to Persona Ride and just generate that extra push against the opponent, and it does matter. When you're swinging for over 4,300,000 point columns against your opponent every single turn post the first ride with Gramgrace, it begins to take its toll. And even with decks like Ava and Chronojet, when you have proper setup and you're keeping up the tempo and you're maintaining the matchup, you actually do pretty well. For my next grade 3, I am playing 4 copies of Knights of War Damage Fasado. Fasado is an on-hit countercharge and soul charge that cannot be retired by card effects, and honestly it's just the best supporting card of the deck right now. Until we get different support later in the future, I think I'm going to be playing Fasado for a very long time because, again, rear guards and Gramgrace are super important. Ava, Chronojet, and other decks right now in the meta have the ability to get rid of 1 rear guard per turn or send stuff to the bottom of the deck, so having a card that you know will stay on the board and has some on-hit pressure to it has been fantastic throughout my entire time with Gramgrace. The fact that it gives you other resources back for your other card effects as well is extremely important, as this deck does use a lot of Counterblast and Soul Blast equally for the Vanguard's ability as well as some of your rearguard effects. It's a great resource management piece that also adds pressure and stays on the board as a solid rearguard, meaning you'll have a 23k attacker in the later game every single turn, unless your opponent decides to spend one of their attacks to get rid of this card, which is a minus for them because that's less cards out of your hand you have to use defending the Vanguard. For my last grade 3, I am playing 1 copy of Gradius Gradle. Persona Riding is extremely important for this deck. If you don't Persona Ride, you will lose. I have accepted that with Gramgrace, that Gramgrace, while it is strong, it doesn't unlock all of its full abilities until you Persona Ride, so therefore you need to be able to Persona Ride as consistently as possible, and this essentially is just a 4th Persona Ride copy. Now for my grade 2s. So my grade 2 lineup is something that has been interesting and that I've been going back and forth with. But one card that I believe is going to be a staple for the deck coming in the future is still 4 copies of Divine Sister Lagoon de Shot. Now this card does everything that the deck needs for a rearguard to do. While it does have a simple effect of becoming a 15k attacker or booster, that is perfectly fine. My idea with this card, and the reason why I maxed it out in my previous list and the reason why I maxed it out now on this list, is because Lagoon de Shot with proper setup is a really strong supporting rearguard in the early game when you're facing off against those Chronojet and Avas. When you need a card that can stay at 15,000 power and just bully their rearguards or bully their Vanguard, this card can do that. Back when I was playing the Genesis ride line, it served that purpose very well, and that was the idea behind it too, was that if I want to play the grade 2 game with Chronojet for a long time, I can use my Chamomile's ability to put a grade 3 into Soul, have this card stay at 15 on the rear guard, and if I need it later, I can just move it to the back row and become a 15k booster. Because every period of the game, this card is strong. Your Persona Red turns, card goes from a 15k to a 25k booster, so if you're boosting a rear guard or if you are boosting a grade 3 unit, the number automatically becomes a magic number against your opponent and affects the way that they guard their attacks. It also becomes a strong attacker if you have to call it out with Gramgrace's ability on Persona Ride turns, becoming a 35k attacker, which is still over the 3300 threshold, which means that, again, it's another magic number with no cost or additional resources need to be spent to make it a good card. This is honestly the most confident pick of the deck that I've had so far in terms of units that I'm playing, hence the reason why I decided to just max it out, because in every situation it's just really good. For my next grade 2, I'm playing 3 copies of Knights of Rendering Flash Cardfighters. Cardfighters has honestly solidified himself as a staple to, I feel like, all Keter Sanctuary decks. This card has everything I needed for a deck, and it does better than most support I had prior. The ability to get extra units on board or fetch out a grade 3 has been amazing because it's come in clutch every single Gramgrace game. Whenever I saw this card and my hand was bad or I just didn't have the pieces on board to make a solid formation, this card came in and saved the day. It's a good target for Gramgrace's ability as well because it's an on-place card, so it doesn't do anything later, so you just move on to Soul for Soul Blast cost later. But it's a nice little resource piece that the deck can take advantage of because we have plenty of cards that recycle the Counterblast and Soul Blast back, so it's never a neg, and it's overall just a solid card. For my next grade 2, I am playing 2 copies of Magic of Alteration Turnar. Turnar is another resource management piece of this deck. It is super important that we are able to access our Gramgrace ability and the effects of our other rear guards because they do cost counterblasts, as you've seen. And cards such as Cardfighters, the next card I'm going to showcase, And even though we have Fasado in the deck for resource management, Fasado has to hit. So you never want your opponent to be able to dictate whether or not you are going to be able to use an ability next turn. And this card just helps guarantee that. Because once you're at 3 damage or more, you get to move into the soul, get a counter charge, and a soul charge by putting this card in there. And you're all set for next turn. It's a really great resource management piece in the deck that's free because it makes space to the next card you have coming in, and overall has just been a solid pick. I will say though that right now this does feel like the most flexible slot in the deck, simply for the fact that if your Fasado is, going off all the time, or if you replace other cards in your deck that do not counterblast, or you're going to go for the Genesis Ride line like I did later in the series, you don't need this in my opinion, because your counterblast is only going to 2 cards then, which is your Cardfighters and your Gramgrace. Because Cardfighters is the only staple card in terms of grade 2 line besides Long Range Shot that I feel like right now you really need for the deck, so therefore you can play something else. But I just think that Tunar right now and the next card that I'm going to showcase will explain why I'm playing this card, or playing this card. Now we have some new additions into the deck. So this is a card that I actually did not know about, but I feel like deserves some spotlight, because after the tournament, this card showed me that it could have saved my life a couple of times in this event. Now, making its debut in this deck is 2 copies of Glorious Storm Dragon. I've never showcased this card before in a deck, so I will explain its ability. It has the skill of Act Rearguard Circle. Once per turn, if you Persona Road this turn, Counterblast 1. Your opponent puts all of their rear guards in the same column as this unit on the bottom of their deck in any order, and this unit gets power plus 5,000 until end of turn. Glorious Storm Dragon is a tech piece that I'm adding to the deck to slow down my opponent while also generating power. Obscuriad, Ava, Chronojet, and the other decks in the current meta of Overdress build up boards over time, or set certain pieces on the board to set up for their next turn. So Glorious Storm Dragon being able to come in and essentially spin those cards back into the deck to make it to where they don't have access units on board, and they can get over the protection effects that the Ava research cards have for the Obscuriads, is incredible. It's a fun way of getting rid of large columns that are coming at you to slow down your opponent while you yourself are making the push needed to win the games. I actually think that Glorious Storm Dragon is a really neat card, and I did not know what it did until I actually looked into it. And the reason why I'm playing this over like another Superior Calling card is because with the Cardbray and the next card that I'm putting into this deck, it has been so much better. I haven't been having issues that I did in the tournament, and the tournament did show me that there was a lot of room for this deck to grow, hence the reason why this video is happening now. But the fact that we get to spin our opponent's board, get extra power, and we have a grade 2 unit in the form of this card, meaning we can target with Cardbray and call it out, fantastic card overall. Finally, for my last addition to the deck, and one I've been wanting to put in for a while, is 1 copy of Atrocious Moth Girl Maple. Now, Atrocious Moth Girl Maple is another card I've put on my channel, but essentially the only skill we care about is her first ability. When your grade 3 or greater Vanguard is placed during the ride phase, if you do not have a unit with Maple in its card name, you may call this card to Rearguard Circle. This card being able to come back continuously means that we're always going to have a unit on board to take advantage of, whether it be the first grade 3 turn or later in the game. And when your opponent is getting rid of your rear guards or the Obscuriads or wiping out your entire front row, and you don't have a good hand after defending yourself, this is how you get your offense back. It might not be the strongest card, but the fact that it's a reoccurring card makes it a consistency piece that improves Gramagrace's offense overall, giving us that extra attack that we need on the rearguard circle to consistently stay at full power. Moving on to my grade 1s, I'm playing the new promo, which is Bringer of Soaring Winds, Lochte, however you say the name. Now, this card is honestly the only reason why I played the Genesis ride line prior to the tournament. I had no practice with that ride line prior, but once I discovered this card, I thought to myself, the Genesis ride line with this card is going to be insane. And the reason being is because you can use Chamomile or Melissa's effect to put a Gramagrace in a soul and one of your Maple pieces or one of your grade 3s, and then your first turn on Gramagrace, you automatically put this card in and you're guaranteed Persona Ride next turn. This card single-handedly made me change my entire ride line because that was the original idea of it. However, post-tournament, I don't think that way anymore. You are naturally going to get the Persona Ride unless you just get like sacked in the early game to where you just can't even do it. So therefore, you're always going to be able to pull this card out in a later game. And because this effect is a later game ability, that means that building the entire ride line around it wasn't needed. And it doesn't do anything else compared to the other cards I've had in the deck. I think that this card is great because it guarantees you Persona Ride. I just don't like the fact that it guarantees you Persona Ride, but I don't like the fact that you can't get access to this ability earlier. And also I don't like the fact that it's an end of turn effect. This card's weird because it is a good card, but the way that they designed it, they made it to where you can't plus hard off of it. If this card said, at the end of the battle, this unit were to boost or attack and then get the next effect, Gramgrace would be so much better. This card would be essentially a +2 because you get to retire this, add a grade 3, draw a card, which means you added 2 cards back to your hand and just for the price of this one, which would have made this card so much better. It's a really powerful promo that does recycle out your Persona rides, but in terms of how good it is, I do think that over time you can start taking one out each time for the deck to put in better cards in the future. For my next grade 1s, I am playing the Aegis Mirror Dragon as well as the 1 copy of the Elementaria Sanctitude. Just your typical G-Series PG lineup. The Elementaria, I mean, comes in, saves it every once in a while. Aegis Mirror Dragon does its thing. Next up for my grade 1s, I'm playing 2 copies of Pink Moth Girl Maple. Now this is the other maple target that I was talking about for the deck, but I also believe that right now it is a staple for Gramgrace. As far as the ratios go, they are up for debate. You are absolutely welcome to take out 1 copy of this, and I would argue even taking out 1 copy of the Lockdy so that you can make room for another grade 1 that you want to put in the deck. I just can't think of any that I want right now, but this is another card that brings itself back from the drop zone in the later game when you Persona Ride, which means that, again, if you Persona Ride and you call out your Maple, the grade 2 first, and then call this card out, you have an entire column ready to go if you do not have the best matchup. Not even that, if you don't have front row units because the Obscuria just blew up your entire front row, and now your formation is all over the place, her being able to come back actually does save the day because she'll get power as well and become a magic number on her own. The Maples bringing themselves back is just so necessary for this deck because without rear guards, Gramgrace really does fall hard. And that was the point that I was failing at in the tournament, which was realizing that I wasn't having the best formations. That and the fact that some of the matchups I just were not familiar with, because while I do understand what the decks do, I don't understand like how to play around it, and that hurt as well. So therefore, post-tournament, I've learned my lesson, and these cards have just been incredible for the deck. The Maple pairing, perfection. Now for my triggers. So my trigger lineup is just a generic 8 critical, 3 draw trigger lineup. I actually am on the fence about a couple of things for my trigger lineup, and I will explain why. With the future meta looking like it's going to be Gondiva, Ava, Chronojet, 2 of those decks that I just stated gain critical via abilities. So therefore, my heal triggers right now, I'm honestly thinking about doing a 2-2 split between regular heals and the critical heals because I just feel as though Gondiva and Ava are going to be extremely popular decks in the future that you're going to have to deal with. Keep in mind, we're also getting new mask support, so therefore, with the additional mask support, certain decks are going to get extra criticals off of that by effects, and that's just more reason to change out your heal triggers. That's for the future. And draw triggers, I'm thinking about honestly upping 1, and truth be told, I'm thinking about changing these to the original crits. I have realized that in my final push turns where I need to call cards out or I just get cards called out with Cardfighters effect, the additional soul is not needed. You have cards in the deck that give you soul, and you have cards such as Tunar and Fasado that can even put themselves into soul. And when this card comes in and it doesn't make that help you make that magic number, it really does hurt because your columns will be awkward and they will reach over the threshold, but the additional 1000 power sometimes does matter when you're trying to make that final game push. On top of that, the reason why I think 1 more draw trigger might be needed is because, again, Gramgrace falls flat on its face when he does not see his pieces. And although I have the Maples in deck now that have really been an asset in improving it, and Glorious Storm Dragon to slow my opponent down their formation, I just think draws might just be super important for this deck right now. I am on the fence about playing fronts. I have thought about taking out one of my crits and one of my draws to play fronts, but personally right now I just feel as though with the way that Gramagrace plays and all of my rear guards having the ability, at least most of them, to gain additional power on the rear guard, I don't feel like it's really needed. You're a 4-attack deck that on turn 4 easily reaches the threshold of over 4,300 on all of your attacks in your rear guard, except 2 of them, so I'm just on the fence about playing fronts. I think the extra shield will definitely be welcome, but as far as attack patterns go and how you feel about front triggers, you're going to have to decide that for your own Gramgrace build. And this card is just incredible. I don't think I want to play the Crayon Elemental one despite losing to it in round 3 to a Youthberg player. I just personally believe that Arma to Know, especially for a deck like this, even if you have the opportunity of decking out, the extra card draw is just very welcome. Or the drive checking from this card is very welcome as well if you're not going through your deck fast enough.